game where the players are on the inside looking out.
Heavy Metal is an amazing game where up to 4 players can compete against each other in a full virtual reality environment.
Virtual reality is quite strange. Not the actual technology behind it all, but the whole discussion surrounding it. VR is still perceived by many to be where gaming ultimately will eventually lead to. That perception exists even outside of just gaming, and is often perceived to be the whole future of entertainment as a whole. But in 2019, that really wasn't the case. Despite virtual reality existing just as long as gaming itself, and the initial huge success around Oculus, it wasn't looking great. Sure, we had some good and fun games like Beat Saber and Superhot, and more ambitious upcoming like Boneworks. They were all fun and well-made games, if you already had VR. The main problem facing it wasn't just the price and space requirements, it was the software, because there was not a single game that could on its own sell the premise of VR, like how Halo sold the world on Xbox, until one studio out of nowhere emerged from the shadows. In late 2019, Valve suddenly dropped their biggest bombshell in decades, a new Half-Life game to be released just a few months later the next year. Not just an episode, but an actual full game. They, after all this time, did a Half-Life 3 confirmed. Sort of, because there was a big catch. It was VR only and a prequel, taking place between Half-Life 1 and 2. I was one of those who was excited, but also quite disappointed. First off, VR was still even more of a niche, and not many had the space for it, nor the money. Second, it had been 12 years since episode 12 left us on a cliffhanger. It had even been such a long time that Mark Laidlaw, the lead writer, had left Valve and written something called Episode 3. It was essentially official fanfiction that was supposed to be the story of episode 3, and it gave the series an unofficial closure, and so it being a prequel was pretty disappointing. But Half-Life going VR was something we should have expected. First off, Valve did already have their own virtual headset. Secondly, the thing about Half-Life making it quite unique for Valve is that they mostly use those games to push new technologies and innovations, which is best exemplified with Half-Life 2's physics. That's one of the reasons episode 3 got nowhere apart from general burnout. In the Half-Life 2 documentary, it is quite clear that they had ideas and concepts that I still have not seen in games. Taking their game series known for innovation and making it VR was a straightforward way for them to have more opportunities to innovate from small to the inconceivable. Regardless, I and most people were excited about the idea of a new Half-Life game, especially because it looked really good in the trailer. The most important thing I and others took away from the trailer though, was not just the gameplay or it being VR, it was this.
You will not save him. Alyx Vance alone cannot prevent his fate.
It hinted towards the game maybe not being entirely a prequel, but that was for us to find out in just a few months. But not me though. No, I had to wait another 2 years for me to have a strong enough computer and the money to buy a Quest 2. But when I put them on and booted up the game, I was just a few moments away from experiencing one of the best gaming experiences possible. So, VR. It's pretty neat. Actually, it's insanely fun and cool, but it also sucks. Pricing, the needed room, and physical danger, and most importantly, the human brain. In short, this form of media requires more from you than simply using a controller on a flat screen, and it was probably the main problem facing Valve. Considering how their own headset sold after the announcement, it most likely meant that Half-Life Alyx would be many people's first ever virtual experience. This not only meant that Valve needed to make a good VR game, but also make a VR game that could also introduce and teach the player about virtual reality as a whole, and that is not easy. But for now, let's begin the game. The game opens up with what is probably stasis, where G-Man put Gordon in for 20 years, before the events of Half-Life 2, and we are shown text telling us it's 5 years before the events of Half-Life 2, while specifying the death of Eli Vance. The game then opens up on City 17, and there's already so much to say. The first thing you will notice is just how good the graphics are. Graphics in VR games have never been at the same standard to normal games, and yet not only is the visuals insane for just being a VR game alone, but it would also be insane if it were a flat screen normal game. Plus, it's also half a decade old. I've seen lots of people being quite impressed by the detail on the beer bottles in the current latest GTA 6 trailer. I, however, wasn't that impressed, considering Valve did it already 6 years before its release. Hell, they even did the same thing with the Steam Pack. And that is probably way more impressive than the graphics, the details. With the introduction of Source 2, you can basically interact with every single thing in the entire game, and it sells the world being a real one that you inhabit. One of my favorite things about this is how it reacts to explosions. Most of the time playing the game, it doesn't feel like one, because to my knowledge, I have never ever encountered a single game-breaking or noticeable bug. Well, mostly. The most insane thing about it is how well it runs, even on lower end PCs. Valve is known for optimizing the hell out of their games, and this is probably their best example. And it makes so immersion is never broken because of low frames or any other technical issues. However, like I mentioned before, this was many players' first ever VR experience, including mine. So Valve needed to make some streamlining, beginning with movement. Now walking. It's a basic concept we all understand, and in gaming it has basically remained unchanged for decades. But because we're talking about VR, it is not that simple. You see, when walking, running, jumping or falling in virtuality, your eyes convince your brain that it's really happening to you in real life, whilst it actually isn't, and you are probably just standing still. It creates a disconnect and causes many to feel motion sickness, whilst others like me don't really feel it. Valve's solution was giving the players the option to customize their movement. You can either teleport to a desired location or use continuous motion. You can also choose whether it cuts to black or not between teleportation. If you choose continuous motion, it's also relatively slow but at a steady pace, which is quite good for easing in players, and doesn't really cause that same disconnect or motion sickness. Climbing up or down ladders or obstacles can often be done manually, but it can also be done automatically. And if you happen to fall down, you also do it relatively slow, which again is a lot easier on the mind. In short, Valve made it so both newcomers and more experienced players could play it. The second thing they did was regarding hands. There is no full body that games like Into the Radius have, only your hands. As much as it might seem like a negative, it in reality is not, nor is it necessarily a plus. Having a virtual representation of your own body is in theory cool, and it does help with immersion. But in practice it can often lead to more problems than solutions. Quite often it can get stuck on objects or block your vision, as it in reality does not track your whole body, but only your hands. Just having hands also goes into something that Valve employee Kerry Davis talked about in a presentation. He mentioned the difference between simulating a real world and simulating the experience for the player, i.e. making the player believe it's real life. He used the example of doors and spent an hour describing the process of just making this feel real to the player. The TLDR is this: whilst only having hands is in itself not realistic, it makes sure that the player feels it's more realistic because there's no simulated body that can obstruct or glitch out for the player. Anyhow, the first chapter is mostly spent just navigating through City 17 and learning about the movement mechanics. Whilst navigating, you and your dad Eli Vance gets arrested by the Combine. Luckily, you are quickly rescued by a new character, Russell. From now on, the story is all about rescuing your dad from a train heading to the prison Nova Prospect. You eventually meet up with Russell to discuss the plan, and it's here Valve introduces what is their best and essential mechanic, the Russells. The Russells are a simple, yet ingenious decision for several reasons. Lore-wise, they function as a prototype for the gravity gun in Half-Life 2. But what I like most about it lore-wise is how it explains something that I always found to be a bit immersion-breaking in VR games. The ability to somehow magically pick up items from far away. And it also acts as the way players can see their own health and ammo, without the need for a distracting UI. But most importantly is what it does to gameplay. To use them, you point at the object you want to pick up, flick your hand wrist, and catch it whilst it's coming towards you. The game is quite forgiving with catching objects, so it's always reliable and easy to learn. Just throwing around and catching random objects is fun on its own, especially since there's always lots of objects for you to mess around with. More than that, they can also be used to pick up items during fights like a magazine or a grenade that would otherwise be out of reach. It is quite difficult to explain just how good it feels to use, as it simply just works. After we get used to the Russells, we are finally introduced to this game's guns, and I think this is where Valve's streamlining for newcomers works at its best and also worse. You are given a regular pistol based off the 1911. However, I recommend you use a mod that replaces it with the USP from Half-Life 2, as it in my opinion fits more with the universe and also just sounds a lot better than the sort of weak sounding base pistol. There are 2 more guns for you to acquire throughout the game, with them being a shotgun and the SMG. The 3 guns are all one-handed and stuck to the hand you have picked as the dominant. To switch, you can toggle the menu and switch between them or unequip the one you're currently using. Because it's VR, Alyx is uniquely from the others in the series gifted with new upsides that come automatically in VR, but also unique obstacles and choices. Take the simple concept of reloading. In a regular shooter, it's just one button click. But because you have to manually do all the steps, it becomes several steps, and thus becomes a more deeper gameplay mechanic. Just mastering your ability to quickly reload a weapon becomes a rewarding experience on its own, without the devs needing to do any work. That being said, there are several ways of handling it, and Valve chose to simplify and streamline it ammo-wise. All the ammo you find in the game is stored by releasing it behind your back. And if you need to reload, you just take out a mag from behind, and the ammo type automatically adjusts depending on what weapon is equipped. By doing this, you have the complexity and skill that comes from VR reloading, without needing to fiddle around trying to find magazines or shells, like what can often happen in games like Into Radius or Ghost of War. Also, all the guns have a way of telling you how much ammo is left, without the need of annoying UI. One cool detail about this is how Alyx herself will tell you how many shells are left when you reload the shotgun, which is a neat touch. Now, when it comes to the actual shooting itself, it feels good. A lot of it comes from how they impact different types of enemies and not necessarily just the guns themselves, so for now, that's all I really have to say about the actual shooting. But if you remember, I also said the guns were also the worst part of the streamlining and simplification, and it's the variety. Now, when it comes to variety itself in the game, I would say it's one of its greatest strengths. The environments, scenarios and enemies are more than just sufficiently varied, but weapon-wise it's quite terrible, with there only being 3 guns and all of them being one-handed, which is extremely lacking even for VR games. Even with the newly introduced ability to mod the guns, it's not nearly enough. All the mods except for the grenade launcher mod for the shotgun only upgrades the guns, but don't really change them to their core. Now I can accept that they're only one-handed, because even though it's cool to have two-handed ARs or pump shotguns, it can feel strange to use them. While the hand pulling the trigger feels normal, the other one holding the front will always feel a bit off, because you are just holding air with no resistance. That being said, they still could have probably easily doubled the amount of one-handed guns that would also fit the universe. 2 I can immediately think of is a revolver that can act just like the one from Half-Life 2, and considering the weird shotgun amalgamation, I think it would be possible to also create a smaller one-handed version of the crossbow. They would both be different from the current weapons and also fit the setting. And whilst I'm being negative, I might as well mention my biggest gripe about the game, and that is something Valve was unique for avoiding, and that is their annoying tutorialization. So tutorials, it's a often forgotten yet important part to master, considering not all players and especially reviewers can often lack skills. This is especially important considering how newcomers to VR will need to figure out all the basics of VR controls. Making it more difficult is that not all were using the same controllers, as you can for example use the Index, Oculus, HTC and most likely more. The way most games do it is to have a simple pop-up telling you what each button does, and even greats like Elden Ring does it. Valve would traditionally avoid this and more or less hide it in how they slowly introduced each element into the game, like they did in Half-Life 2. For this they went a traditional way of pop-ups, and whilst I prefer the other one, this one still works just fine. But they just don't stop. In pretty much every chapter, for just basic shit they have already told me about 5 fucking times, on constant repeat, they just won't stop telling me. I mean, just look at this. And the absolute best part is, you cannot disable it. They let you choose how the audience will see the game, which in no way at all affects you, but they just won't let you turn off the tutorial pop-ups for, I don't know, I actually don't know, like, what? Anyways, to get to the train carrying Eli, you need to go through the quarantine zone, and it's here where I must also mention the art style. Valve and having good art styles go hand in hand. The best example of this is obviously Team Fortress 2, which after almost 2 decades holds up pretty good. But my personal favorite is Portal 2. Or at least it was until this game came out. Now, much, if not most, of this game's art and visual design can be traced all the way back from Half-Life 2. To me, the key element has always been the Combine. The Combine's main color scheme being metallic and blue makes it stand out as a stark contrast to City 17 and the old Earth in general. I have always loved how they integrate their technology on top of our own, which is best represented by the Citadel. More than that, I just love how the Combine look. Their architecture and vehicles are both otherworldly and very foreign, whilst being quite simple and very angular and sharp. It's just a perfect mix of strange and unexplainable alien complexity, and yet remaining quite simple, somewhat reminding me of the Forerunner's architecture in Halo Combat Evolved. It's also very organic as the Combine fuses their technology with alien life forms, which is something I think Alyx emphasizes more, with the healing stations and this weird power mechanism being a prime example. Alyx for the most part just takes the initial design and just adds more to it with some new and very improved textures and lighting. This of course doesn't just apply to the Combine, I just think it's the strongest aspect. But before entering the quarantine zone, you must first use the newly introduced multi-tool. It is used to hack many different things throughout the game in the form of minigames. Now, minigames in general is something I have never really liked. To quote H-Bomber Guy, all hacking minigames are bad, even when they are good. This is at first a moronic statement, but what he meant, and something I agree with, is that you could have minigames that are on their own quite fun. However, if you repeat it too often, it just becomes tedious and boring. Luckily, Valve made it so there were just not one, but 4 in total. They all work very well because of how they all in some way take use of the fact that it is in VR, and how you need to use your actual hands instead of just a mouse. Had they made it in a non-VR game, I'm not sure if I would feel the same about them. But to add a bit more gameplay variety rather than just the 4 minigames, the multi-tool is also used to rewrite electricity, and in certain puzzles and scenarios it is utilized extremely well. But just like with the hacking, I'm not really sure I would like it if it was in a non-VR title. Also, a quick thing I must mention is the sound design, which is so well made and detailed for something so relatively small. Besides hacking, the game also introduces us to resin. Resin works as a currency that can be used at special Combine upgrade stations for your weapons. Resin is also a small, simple, yet ingenious decision. First, I just like having the option to loot more things that are just not health and ammo. And I just love being able to upgrade weapons and gear in games. But I think what it might do best is to help introduce you to the new engine physics. The first resins are slightly hidden, with them becoming more and more so. The game often lets you see them early to force you to interact with the world's physics and teach you that yes, you actually can interact with that object that you otherwise probably would not think was possible. This ends with you scouring every nook and cranny, opening drawers, lockers and wardrobes. The result is you interacting way more with the actual world and thus becoming more immersed in it. Shortly after entering the quarantine zone, we are finally introduced to the game's first enemies, Headcrabs zombies and barnacles. They act and function just like how they did in the previous titles, but their animation and detail sticks out much more in the best way. Despite Alyx not being advertised as a horror game, the zombies might as well be. They can also have some kind of green alien thing sticking out, which when shot will explode. That's always highly satisfying. Something you might notice is that all enemies in general are fewer in numbers, but to compensate they have a higher amount of HP, making the combat more slow paced compared to previous titles. Once again, like usual, it's because of VR. Tackling many enemies at once is far easier with a mouse and keyboard. The best comparison is to play 1 hour of Half-Life 2 and then play the mod conversion, which is really good and free. Whilst it is manageable, it is far more intense in VR. You continue throughout the zone acquiring more weapons and a flashlight, which is masterfully used to utterly terrify the player. And after tensely navigating a room ready to explode, we finally get to face off against the Combine. They are a worthy threat and are, like pretty much all enemies, extremely fun to fight against. The regular grunts use a SMG and are quite basic. They do carry tanks on their back that can be exploded by shooting them. Apart from the regular soldier grunts, you also have commanders that can deploy flying manhacks. Chargers that, apart from their menacing footsteps and looks, are heavily armed with a shotgun and does a lot of damage up close, and they can also deploy a shield. The last is a machine gunner, which acts as the suppressor pinning you down. Each element of the Combine is slowly introduced throughout the game, and when combined, chargers do as the name suggests, Minigunners pin you down, whilst commanders lead the other soldiers and throw manhacks at you, whilst the grunts act as the base firepower. And the AI is really smart in combat, utilizing each unit's type of strength. Something I will also note is that they are super well animated. Usually in all FPS games, I will notice when certain types of animations kick in, like when they switch to cover. But Valve in their usual fashion has made it so it all flows together as if it all were just one big long motion capture. The game could have thrown them constantly at you, but it restrains itself and uses them just the right amount. Something more that makes them stand out is the several times this game's soundtrack accompanies them. Mike Morawski was the lead composer instead of the previous Kaylee Bailey, and he did an amazing job. The standouts are of course the combat OSTs and the ones in the final chapter, but also the more ambient music is also very well done and quite atmospheric. In my non-musically subjective opinion though. We do eventually rescue Eli by making the train crash in a really cool real-time cinematic, and also with the help of a Vortigon we met earlier. We make it to a hotel infected by the Zen life, and once again Valve's environmental detail is on another level. The standout in the hotel chapter is the unique type of enemy, lightning dogs. They are as a concept and visually really cool, but in gameplay they are just okay. They are just on their own quite bullet spongy, but they can also reincarnate dead corpses, which while is cool and quite terrifying honestly, it quickly becomes quite annoying waiting for the spots you need to shoot to pop up. But just when you begin to get a bit tired of them, the chapter quickly ends and they are never seen again. The story has also by now evolved from rescuing your dad Eli to now reach and breach a large floating vault containing some kind of combine weapon. This will remain as the main goal for the rest of the game as you get closer and closer to it. In order to access the vault, we take down a substation in the hotel by freeing a Vortigon that is used to power it. He reassures us that he and the other Vortigons will take care of the other substations, so all we have to do is get to the vault. And as we continue in the zone, we will eventually, after fighting the Combine, be forced to go through an old abandoned vodka distillery. And it's where one of the most talked about chapters takes place. Jeff. As we explore, we encounter a guy who shows us and explains what and who Jeff is. Jeff is some kind of zombie that is unable to be killed, but he has no vision, but in return can also hear quite well. Because of this, he can be easily manipulated by, for example, throwing a bottle. Often we continue through the distillery, encountering spores that makes us cough if we don't use our hands to cover the mouth, and also a unique type of door lock which might come in handy to know about. Eventually, however, we come face to face with Jeff. The goal is to simply open a gate and use the elevator that's behind it, but turning the wheel to open the gate creates a lot of noise and takes too long before Jeff eventually gets to you. But if you look closely, you can see that a storage unit uses the same type of door lock that we just encountered earlier and can be locked from the outside. Using this to our advantage, we can lure him in and trap him by locking the door. But when doing it, you better be careful because there are spores coming out of Jeff, so you have to cover your mouth if he gets close. And after this tense encounter, we can finally escape on the elevator and get out of. No biggie, we just need to rewire the electricity, which seems to be coming from. After luring him out, we can use the multi-tool, but in doing so, you will accidentally activate a speaker, forcing you to quickly hide or throw something away from where you are standing. After that even more tense situation, you can finally escape, except he also makes it on the elevator, forcing you to use it whilst he is on it at the same time. After riding the elevator and avoiding him for a short while, we finally make it to safety outside. The calm and sunny outside serves as a perfect contrast to the dark and almost claustrophobic inside. But in order for us to leave the distillery, we need to open a large hatch that will require 3 power units. Whilst they are not hard to find, they all require you to make a lot of noise when acquiring them, so avoiding and outsmarting Jeff will be a constant. Eventually, we get to trap him in a trash compactor and opening the hatch, ending the chapter. The chapter Jeff is a standout for just how scary and tense it is, with you never actually firing your weapon. I really like this chapter, as I think it is the chapter that best utilizes the gravity gloves and the game's physics with just how often you need to throw things and the many useful extra items you can acquire if you take the risk of making noises. I think what I like most is how Jeff is a terrifying beast visually, noise-wise and in gameplay, because of the noises he makes and the fact that he's unkillable. But despite it, you can still fight back with noise. Also, just the fact that you need to actually physically cover your mouth when it's closed, thanks to the spores, just adds so much extra tension and immersion. The chapter is also fairly short, being under an hour, yet it feels like you experience so much. And the next chapter after serves as a nice contrast. After going down the tunnel, we get to a heavily combat focused chapter, which still this late in the game introduces us to new stuff, and the new and main focus is the Antlions. The Antlions are easily my favorite enemy to fight. They act quite simple, being a horde melee enemy which tries to overwhelm you. Their skins can't be damaged, but they have weak spots. The main way of killing them is to either shoot their sometimes exposed back, that is covered by the wings, or to shoot each leg, making it easier to shoot the back. This mechanic is at its most fun when there are several charging you at once, which forces you to move around and strategize between who to simply shoot a leg off and cripple and make slower, and which to focus on killing. The best aspect about them is simply how satisfying it is to shoot and kill them, with how they react visually and the crunchy satisfying sound it makes. But also something more is a new type of antlion that is blue and shoots deadly blue fluid at you from a distance. They are killed the same way and are on their own okay, but when complementing the regular close range is when I think they work really well. As I said, this chapter is heavily combat based, with you even fighting the Combine on their own and in a freeway battle at times. And for this reason I would say that this is in pure gameplay my favorite chapter, with some few puzzles to increase the variety even more and downtime. Also, in this chapter the story makes a twist where it turns out the vault is not just containing a weapon, but instead a person who supposedly survived Black Mesa. Your father Eli is convinced it could be Gordon Freeman being held captive, but considering the vault is powered using Vorticon energy, it could perhaps be another man beginning with G. Eventually we make it to a control station keeping the vault afloat, where we finally bring it down in a once again visual masterpiece. Through the rubble we make it to an elevator that needs to be powered, but next to it also lies a seemingly dead Strider. Striders were one of the first things we saw in the beginning, which were used to give us a sense of scale and remind us just how terrifying the Combine is. And so seeing it this late only means one thing. When we do activate the power to the elevator, it also reactivates the Strider. And this kicks off an intense chase sequence with us running and dodging from bullets whilst the Strider tears down walls to get to us, and it's all being excellently scored in the background. We even face off against regular Combine soldiers, which is when the music evolves and heavy synths kick in, to create what is easily my favorite combat music in all Valve games. And after finally dealing with the Combine, we then face against the Strider as the music reaches its crescendo as we use a stationary grenade launcher to finally put it down, and thus ending this intense combat chapter and with nothing more standing in our way. Now, so far Valve has been very careful in making sure that they haven't made the player do anything that would be likely to be confusing or hard on the player's mind. They've made combat, movement and gameplay that has depth and fun for experienced players, but also that is fun for newcomers and beginners to VR as a whole. But because it is the final chapter and the player is most likely used to VR now, and the fact that Vorticon power and the Combine technology as a whole is quite mysterious, Valve used this to test the limits of virtual reality. After entering the vault, we are loaded into an apartment, which makes sense considering the vault was simply built around an already existing apartment complex, but the environment is all glowing bluish green as objects defy gravity, apparitions of past people appear, whilst the music consists of chaotic inverted instruments that somehow create a comprehensible melody. And as we open a door, the heart of the vault is revealed in what is probably my favorite visual shot in any game of all time. As we continue going deeper, the environments twist more and more as the rooms become sideways, upside down and mirrored, whilst gravity becomes confusing. It is all quite terrifying in a more cosmic horror way, and just before we get to the cell housing the mysterious prisoner, we face off against the Combine for the final time. When we went up the vault, our guns were lost, but we still kept the Russell gloves, and they can be used to absorb Vorticon energy and be thrown back at the soldiers, and it's extremely fun to use. With this, we make a final push against the last few defenders, and then finally, make it to the chamber, and use our energized gloves to break the cell, freeing who? But of course, the G-Man. He explains how time is flexible and that his employers will on the occasion let him nudge certain things in a particular direction. As a reward for freeing him, he asks what we, Alyx, would want to be nudged. Alyx answers that she wants the combine of Earth, which of course would be a too large of a nudge. Instead, he offers us one, showing us the end of Half-Life 2 Episode 2. He lets us instead kill the advisor and thus saving Eli. But in turn, she will be the replacement for Gordon, and is quote-unquote hired and put in stasis, where Gordon found himself between the events of Half-Life 2 and 1, ending the game. Now, if it ended here, I and most likely many more would be quite annoyed how we waited over a decade for a new game for it to also end on a even bigger cliffhanger. But just as the credits begin to end, we start to hear a familiar sound.
Warning. Vital signs critical. Seek medical attention.
Gordon! Gordon! Wake up, Gordon. She's gone, Gordon. She's gone. Son of a bitch, it has unforeseen consequences. I knew it. When I get my hands on him, I'm gonna... figure this out. Right now. Come on, Gordon. We got work to do.
So what does it mean? Well, it most likely means that after almost 2 decades, we could all say that Half-Life 3 was unironically confirmed, or something similar. Story-wise, it is quite hard to say with stories involving time travel. One more quick thing I mentioned earlier was also mods. Half of the franchise is known for its mods, whether it was Garry's or Counter-Strike. There have been several standout mods like Leviathan and Gunman Contracts, which led to the developer taking the idea and making it a standalone one, which is quite fitting considering the origins of many other Valve games. Now, the video was supposed to end here with a big conclusion about all the stuff the game did right and why it is a VR masterpiece, but it was when watching Jacksepticeye's Let's Play for this video where he said something after the ending that stuck out to me.
Right now, I cannot wait to see where stuff goes from this.
And so the question is, where did it all go? Half-Life Alyx was most likely a commercial success, as it led to a huge increase of Valve Index sales and peaked with over 42,000 current players. And yet, despite it being over 5 years since, the VR landscape still remains for the most part unchanged, and not in a good way. When mentioning big AAA size or quality games that could match Alyx, there is none that could compare that most people are aware of. The headset market is also not in the best spot, with the recent failures like Apple Vision Pro and the PlayStation VR 2 for the PS5, which was a letdown according to Sony. Even the big player Meta has had its marketplace revenues stagnate, and its allegedly 20 million Quests sold would put it up with the GameCube, which, if you don't know, was not seen as a success. And so why is that? Why did Half-Life Alyx not really change anything? And why is VR still seen as more of a prototype with huge potential? I have already much earlier mentioned 3 key reasons. The first, which is quite simple, is the pricing. It is the easiest to explain as most ordinary players don't have hundreds of dollars that are required to purchase a headset. For example, if you want to play Half-Life Alyx with your PlayStation 2 VR headset, you will first need to buy a PS5, then the headset and controllers, whilst also having a computer for it to be connected to, which means spending at least $1,000+. Platforms like Meta are not that expensive if you factor in that it doesn't need a game console or PC to be used, but it's still hundreds of dollars. The second is room requirement, which, if you have seen videos of when it isn't available, it can often lead to painful consequences. However, if you're careful, you don't really need that much, and the Quest and most likely other headsets have it so it can warn you when you get too close to where you don't want to be. The third I mentioned was the human brain, and how some just get sick when playing games in virtual reality, which limits the player base, and it's the obstacle that probably can't be moved. But there's also a fourth factor, which is twofolded, and I think is the most important for why virtual reality still is in its strange stage. and it's the amount of games and console exclusivity. When I say there's a lack of games, I know many VR players, including me, will disagree. To name a few, there's of course half of Alyx, the new virtual Batman game, virtual Assassin's Creed, Inter Radius 1 and 2, Beat Saber, Super Hot, Duck Season, Boneworks and Labs, Blade and Sorcery, and the VR remakes of Resident Evil 4 Remake and 8 Village. And that's just scratching the surface. The problem is not a lack of good VR games as a whole, but good large games that could be a console seller and convince someone to buy into VR as a whole. To this day, I still think that only Alyx would qualify. Games like Resident Evil 4 VR does seem to be a huge, well-polished game, but considering it is a remake of a remake, it probably won't be enough to buy a headset for. You could make the case that if you combine the few large and well-known games, it could work as a console-selling package as a whole. But that's where the second part of the problem comes in, good old console exclusivity. People joke that consoles like PS5 have no games, but even if you exclude the fact you have access to PS4 titles, you still have Spider-Man 2, Horizon Forbidden West, God of War Ragnarok, Death Stranding 2, Stellar Blade, Ratchet & Clank Rifts Apart, Ghost of Yotai, and much more. But when it comes to VR, if I, a Quest 2 user, wants to play the new Resident Evil VR remakes, which looks so much fun, I must buy the PS5 console and its headset. If you are a Quest user and want to play PC VR exclusive game like Alyx, you must have a PC, which I luckily do, but others don't. If I, as a Quest 2 user, wants to play the Quest exclusive Batman game, I can't because it's specifically Quest 3 only, so all other type of Quest users are fucked. And I could go on. If there were enough games, having them be exclusive to a certain headset would be fine, but because there's such a small supply of them, it just makes it much more difficult to enjoy the few games that exist. So where does it all leave us? What was the point of me mentioning this? Well, I think it is important when discussing the strange place half of Alyx finds itself in. It is an undisputed virtual reality masterpiece that everyone who plays recommends, that was also foretold would usher in a new VR revolution that never was. It set a new virtual bar that no one could or even dared to reach again, and will for the foreseeable future only be remembered by the last few after credit seconds, as its relevance fades away with time.